I feel like most Americans, you've probably done an excellent job saving for retirement. But saving and spending are two totally separate different things. I found that there's seven rules to live by for retirement security. And in the upcoming modules, we're going to cover each rule in depth. I've been in the wealth management business for over 19 years. And in my experience over the last 19 years, having worked with hundreds and hundreds of families to help them successfully retire, in my experience, it's been that if you follow these seven rules, you have a higher probability of retiring successfully. So let's talk about these seven rules and let's go in depth into each of the seven so you understand how to properly structure and position your assets for a successful and secure retirement. And let's start with rule number one. Rule number one is by far the most important. Rule number one is to avoid large losses, and I call this the golden rule. Why is the number one rule to avoid large losses? Well, this is how bear markets come across. And this picture is a little humorous, I know, but most people feel like this fisherman. You're sitting on years and years of stock market gains. All of a sudden, you look over your shoulder and you see a bear that's coming maybe not only for the fish, but maybe for you as well. The reality is that bear markets, they come unannounced and they're very difficult to plan for. If we look back to 1929, there's been 16 bear markets since 1929. That works out to about one every 5 years. Now, does a bear market happen exactly every 5 years? Of course not. But on average, about one every 5 years has been a bear market, and the average bear market lasts about 18 months. From the time that stocks hit their high to when they bottom out, it's about an 18-month process, with the average bear market loss being 39%. Think about this. If you retire at 65, you must plan for at least another 4, 5, maybe even 6 bear markets in retirement, losing on average 39% each time. So this raises a very basic question. With an asset that's this volatile, how are we supposed to draw a dependable income off here to replace your salary if every 5 years we have to plan for a bear market loss of 39%? So again, go back to that example. If you retired at age 65 and the average bear market recovery has been about 6.5 years, like we saw in 2000 or 2008, that means you would have to wait to about age 72 to recover your money. Well, are you really willing to give up prime health years waiting for a market recovery? And what would be the impact on you and your spouse's lifestyle if you were to do that? The average bear market may be 6.5 years to recover, but the reality is if you're misallocated, if you have too much risk in the assets and you're not properly positioned with your assets for retirement, it can be a much longer than 6.5 year recovery time. If we go back to 2000 and we just look at the big guys, these are the big tech names. We're not even talking about the small players, the Ciscos, the Microsofts of the world, the Amazons. We can see that the technology index crashed over 75% in 2000. Let's think about this. If you're overly allocated to technology stocks in 2000, it would have taken you not 6.5 years to recover like the broader markets, it would have taken you over 17 years, 3 months, and 22 days. I mean, think about that. That's 6,323 days. 6.5 years, 17 years. Unfortunately, for a lot of people, that's going to be longer than their entire retirement. And it's a similar story if we go back to 2008. Right? You think about this, if you went down to Vanguard, you went down to Fidelity, you went down maybe even to an Oppenheimer where I worked for, back in the late 2000s, they said it's a whole new world, it's a brave new economy, you got to buy these growth stocks. And we saw that played out. Well, then you go back in 2006, 2007, they said, you know what, we were wrong about that, but don't worry, we've got something better for you this time. Safe, secure banks. Been around 100 years, high credit rating, you can buy Lehman preferreds, Bear Stearns preferreds. Well, we know how that worked out. If you were overly exposed to financial stocks in 2008, it would have been over 12 years to recover. In fact, it would have been 12 years, 9 months, and 22 days to fully recover. Think about that. That's over 4,678 days to recover just to get back to even. That doesn't include any fees, any taxes, or any distributions coming off your portfolio. So the average bear market recovery may be 6.5 years, but if you're misallocated, it could be 12 years, 17 years, or more. So why is the number one rule to avoid large losses? Well, the reality is you probably feel something intuitively that you've never been told explicitly, and it's a big part of the reason you're probably watching our content is that you feel that you may be taking too much risk at this stage in life. And the reality is that losses are and can be very difficult to recover. So let's go through an example here. And let's assume you've got $1 million saved and you lose 50%, just like you would have in 2000 or 2008. Well, that $1 million, if you suffer a 50% loss, you lose $500,000 and you're left with $500,000 in savings. To turn that $500,000 back into the original $1 million, to recover what you lost, which is what most people want to do, would now require a 100% recovery gain. And that's before fees, before taxes, and before any distributions coming off. Well, how realistic is it for us to earn a 100% recovery gain? And I know what you're thinking. You think, but wait a minute, the stock market always comes back. And you know what? I am very fortunate. I've been traveling across the country with my father primarily. We've been to Europe, we've been to the Middle East, we've been to Asia. And I'm a big believer that the American system will always come back. And I do believe the stock market will come back, but the question is, do you have time at this stage for your own individual portfolio to recover? Remember, we talked about the average recovery being 6.5 years, and if you're overly exposed to a hot area, it could be 12 years, 17 years or more. Now, at a 40% loss on $1 million, you're going to suffer a $400,000 loss. That $1 million is going to turn into $600,000, and now we're going to need a recovery gain of 66.7%. And at this stage, you're probably asking yourself now, well, wait a minute, Chris, there's no way I have that level of risk in my portfolio. The reality is, if you own a 60-40 portfolio, 60% stocks, 40% bonds, or some variation of that, that lost between 35 to 45% of its value in 2008. In fact, the number one risk score that we see when we do a risk analysis, which is where we use third-party software to take your actual positions and run them through to show you how they would have held up in 2008, the number one risk score that we see is about 40 to 45%. And even at a 30% loss on $1 million, if you suffer a $300,000 loss, I mean, just think about how long it took you to save that $300,000. Are you really okay with giving it up like that in some type of market volatility? Well, the $1 million now drops to $700,000, and now we need a recovery gain of 42.9%. You know, for most people, and if you're watching this content, you probably do feel you've got too much risk. And the first step is to find out how much risk is in your portfolio. Our planning process always starts with doing what's called a risk audit. We take your actual positions, we run them through third-party software, and objectively tell you exactly how much risk you have in your portfolio today. And we break it down on a percentage and a dollars and cents basis so you can decide whether or not that's the correct level of risk and the level of risk that you want to be taking at this stage in life. The first step is to understand how much risk is in your portfolio and then decide if that's the right level of risk that you want to be taking at this stage. We're talking about the 7 rules for retirement security. And in my experience, having started in wealth management over 19 years ago, working for one of the largest wealth managers at Oppenheimer here in New York City, it's been my experience that if you follow these 7 rules, these will give you the highest probability for having a successful and secure retirement.